G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the Life of Messiah. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian walk and in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming. Last week we had Jesus. He finished off his admonitions to his disciples, and then he moved into his high priestly prayer in the garden. One of the lessons we learned last week, that Jesus, in making his request to God the Father, he always gave his reasons for those requests, which is a good thing for us to remember when we're making our petitions and requests to God. We see that his agony in Gethsemane, what was he agonizing over? Well, it was not his death, because he already knew he was going to die from before the foundation of the world. It was not the fear of premature death, because he was in control of everything. But what it was he was going to be taking this cup. He was agonizing over this cup, and this cup was the wrath of God against sin. And he believed that his mission had failed. But, he had a bit of encouragement with an angel coming along and encouraging him. And that we see out of Isaiah 49. And so what we see here is that Jesus, the cup that he was agonizing over, was what he had not known previously in his humanity, was that there's going to come a time of separation from God the Father. And that was going to be for that we'll see later on, will be for that 3 hours on the cross, where everything went dark, and where he no longer calls him Father, but he calls him, my God, why have you forsaken me? Now, 3 times Jesus prayed for this cup to be removed, and this was a cup of the wrath of God, but it was always with the proviso that it was not my will, but thine be done. And we see from it that it was the Father's will that he partake of this cup. Okay, so tonight we're looking at the arrest and his trial, and there's a couple of things we're going to look at here. We're going to look at this is Friday the 15th of Nisan, April the 7th, 30 AD. And this is the 9th major segment of the life of Messiah, and this has to do with the trial of the king. There's some laws of the Sanhedrin we're going to look at shortly, because these laws relate to holding these religious trials. And what we've seen over and over right throughout the gospel so far is the fact that the main thing which the Pharisees had against Jesus was his violation of their traditional laws, or the laws of the elders, or the oral law, and that's the Mishnah. The Mishnah, and in the Gospels you see it called the traditions of the fathers, or the traditions of the elders, and that's the Mishnah. Remember, they were the laws that they had made up. The Pharisees were never able to accuse Jesus of breaking any commandment of the Mosaic law. He was the only Jew who ever lived who kept the law perfectly. So they had to accuse him of violating Mishnaic law, their oral laws. Now, in their hurried attempt to get rid of him, we're going to find that they themselves are going to violate those very same laws that they were accusing Jesus of violating. In the course of the arrest and the religious trial of Jesus, the leaders are going to violate a total of 22 of their own laws. And there are other laws relating to the proceedings of a court, but those were not violated according to what we know in the Gospels here. Now, the Mishnah included the laws of the Sanhedrin regarding trials, and this has to do with trials regarding capital offenses. Capital offenses was where the person would be sentenced to death. And here is a list of rules, and these rules come from several rabbinic sources, along with, we're going to see some comments with them as we go through. Okay, this is a brief summary of these laws which they broke. The numbering is our numbering. First of all, there was to be no arrest by the religious authorities that was affected by a bribe. And that comes out of Exodus chapter 23, verse 8. Secondly, there were to be no steps made towards criminal proceedings after sunset. And this was to avoid the possibility of a conspiracy, especially one that would be carried out using the cover of night. Once the sun had officially set, the authorities were not to proceed with any form of criminal proceedings, none whatsoever. And remember, by Jewish reckoning of time, the sun officially sets once 3 stars are visible in the sky. Third law, neither the judges nor the Sanhedrin members were allowed to participate in the arrest. Why? Because the purpose was to ensure their neutrality. If they participated in the arrest, it meant that they had already taken sides. The fourth law, there were to be no trials before the morning sacrifice. All of the daily morning rituals in the temple had to be completed before any trial could be conducted. Fifth law, all trials were to be in public. There were to be no secret trials. And in keeping with the second rule, secret trials were forbidden in order to avoid the possibility of a conspiracy. So they're the first 5. The sixth law, the Sanhedrin trials could only be conducted in the hall of judgment in the temple compound. Since every trial had to be public, the people would have to know where to go to observe a trial. And Sanhedrin trials, therefore, had to be held only in this room, the hall of judgment in the temple compound. You can also see it sometimes written up as a chamber of hewn stones. Seventh law, in the trial procedure, the defense was to lead. Then after he gave his defense, the accusation would then come. This is the reverse that we have in our Western system. So the defense provided all reasons why the accused could not be guilty of anything and presented character witnesses first. Then 2 or 3 witnesses for the prosecution officially presented the accusation. The eighth law, all may argue in favor of acquittal, but all may not argue in favor of conviction. It was permissible under Jewish criminal law to stack the deck in favor of the accused, but not against him. It was permissible for everyone to argue only for acquittal, but it was not permissible for everyone to argue only for conviction. The accused had to have at least one defender in that trial. Rule 9, there were to be 2 or 3 witnesses and their testimony had to agree in every detail. And this rule was based on Deuteronomy chapter 19, verse 15. Rule number 10, there was to be no allowance for the accused to testify against himself. This was to avoid 2 possible situations. First of all, a man might be suicidal and so confess to a crime he didn't commit. That's the first reason. Second, he might be trying to protect someone else who was guilty and so confess to a crime he did not commit. So the individual himself could not be counted among the 2 witnesses that were minimally required for a court case to be heard. Rule number 11, the high priest was forbidden to tear his garments. And again, this rule is based upon Leviticus chapter 21, verse 10. In the Jewish context, the tearing of garments was a sign of the emotions. For example, if a family member died, the relatives would wear torn clothing. And this also happened if a family member married a Gentile, or became a believer in Jesus. Other family members would tear their garments. So because the trial had to be based on facts presented by 2 or 3 witnesses, it could not be based on emotions, and therefore the high priest could not tear his clothing during the trial to display any emotions at all. Rule number 12, judges could not initiate the charges. They could only investigate charges brought to them. And this is similar back to the 3rd rule, and this law was supposed to keep judges neutral. If they originated the charge, it would mean that they had already taken sides. Rule number 13 was to do with blasphemy, and the accusation of blasphemy was only valid if the name of God itself was pronounced. And in Hebrew, the name of God is comprised of 4 letters that correspond to the Latin letters YHWH or YHVH. So, unless a person actually pronounced this 4-letter name of God, they could not technically be accused of blasphemy. Rule number 14. A person could not be condemned solely on the basis of his own words. And this rule necessitated the requirement to have 2 witnesses. Rule number 15. The verdict could not be announced at night. Why was this? Because this rule was in place to avoid a rush to judgment. It might have been a very long day with many witnesses being questioned, arguments going back and forth, and people getting tired and a bit edgy and want to go home for dinner. And to avoid a rush to judgment, once the night had come, meaning once 3 stars are seen in the sky, the judges had to wait until the next day to announce the verdict. Even if they knew what it would be, they still had to wait till the next day. Rule number 16, in the case of capital punishment, where the death sentence was going to be brought out, the trial and guilty verdict, so the trial and then the verdict could not occur at the same time, but they had to be separated by at least 24 hours. And the purpose of this separation of time was to permit more time for the information, if there's any new information, to become available, which might favor the accused. So they gave a 24-hour gap of time between the trial and between the guilty verdict, just in case someone was away and they've just come back and they've heard about it and they can give evidence. Rule number 17, voting for the death penalty had to be done by individual count, and it had to begin with the youngest member of the Sanhedrin first. Why? That way the young ones would not be influenced by the elders. So the young ones would cast their vote first, followed by the other members. Rule number 18, and this is a doozy, this one. A unanimous decision for guilt showed innocence, since it is impossible for 23 to 71 men to agree without plotting. The figure 71 is the full Sanhedrin membership. Not all the members needed to be present, but there had to be a minimum of 23. However, even with the minimum, it was inconceivable in a Jewish context that all 23 men could agree on one issue unless there was a plot involved. And this came from the observation that Jews enjoy arguing amongst themselves, which we saw earlier on when we talked about the school of the Sanhedrin. So this is a fantastic rule. This one, Rule 18. Now, Rule 19. The sentence could only be pronounced 3 days after the guilty verdict. The trial and the verdict had to be separated by 24 hours. That's the trial and the verdict. but 3 more days had to pass before pronouncing the sentence, for the same reason, to allow more time for information to come forth that would favor the accused. So they were never in a rush to condemn a man to death. Rule number 20, judges were to be humane and kind. Rule number 21, a person condemned to death was not to be scourged or beaten before his execution. Rule number 22, no trials were allowed on the eve of the Sabbath or on a feast day. So those are the 22 laws which had previously been passed by the Sanhedrin and which would be violated by them in connection with the religious trial of Jesus. These 22 will be violated either during the arrest or the trial of Jesus. Their main accusation against Jesus was that he broke the Mishnaic laws, and they were now going to be guilty of the very same offense themselves. Okay, we're going to look at the arrest first up. Now, the Pharisees rejected Jesus as the Messiah of Israel because he repudiated their Mishnaic laws. But ironically, we're going to see that they're going to break 22 of their own. It's the 15th of Nisan, April 7, AD 30, or actually another time that it could be April the 3rd, AD 33, because both of these days in these years have Passover the night before the Sabbath. Okay. So Jesus is now betrayed, he's now arrested, he's now forsaken. And we look into, there are several passages here. We have John chapter 18, verses 2 to 11. We have Matthew 26, 47 to 56, and Mark 14, 43 to 52, and Luke 22, 47 to 53. So Jesus and the 11 disciples, they're still in the Garden of Gethsemane. And in the John account, John 18, verse 2, we're told, now Judas, which betrayed him, knew the place, for Jesus oft times resorted there with his disciples. So remember, we mentioned it earlier, I think we did mention it earlier. Judas is needed for 3 reasons, or 3 functions in this trial. The first reason that Judas is needed is so that he could show the arresting party where Jesus could be found on his own, apart from the multitude. Why? Because Judas knew his habits. He used to go here and pray quite a lot. He used to hide away from the multitude in the Garden of Gethsemane. He was able to, so now Judas is able to lead the arresting party to where Jesus is. So that's the first function. And in verse 3 of John 18, we read, Judas, then having received the band of soldiers and officers, the band of soldiers, it's a cohort. A cohort means he was accompanied by a Roman cohort, which would be anywhere between 400 and 600 soldiers. So he had here fulfilled another function here for which he had been hired by paying at 30 pieces of silver. Remember that by Roman law, before the Romans could release the cohort for the arrest, a formal indictment had to be brought to the officer in charge. They're not just going to send out 400 men on some willy-nilly charge. They have to have a charge brought before, and so they can release these men. So what we know from this then is that after Judas had left the upper room, after he'd left the room where they were sharing Passover, he went to the chief priests and the elders, and he would have told them, listen, Jesus knows that I'm going to betray him, right? So Jesus, he's on to me, and therefore we need to act now. Now remember, they didn't want to act at Passover. They wanted to do it after Passover. Now, at this time, Passover time, Pontius Pilate usually resided in Caesarea. But what he does is he comes down to Jerusalem during the feast to maintain order. And Judas would have then have gone to Pilate, and he would have produced a charge before him for which Jesus could be tried under Roman law. And it appears here to have been sedition. And that's what we'll see a little bit later. Although it was the small hours of the morning, Pilate was already dressed and he was ready to conduct a trial the moment the arresting party arrived at the Praetorium. Judas had been there earlier. So Judas has already told Pilate about what the charge is. So Pilate is now ready and waiting for Jesus to be brought back. So when Judas had been brought before Pilate and had given him the official charge, these 400 to 600 men would have been detailed to accompany Judas in order to make the arrest. And then Judas would have then led them to the Garden of Gethsemane. So that we see two of his three functions there. He needs to take him to where he is, and he needs to produce a charge before the Romans to release the arresting party. So for his third function, he would be needed as the prosecuting witness at the civil trial. And that's before the Roman authorities. He's going to fail. He's not going to make that one. In verse 2 of John 18, we see the violation of one of the Sanhedrin laws here, which was that there was to be no arrest by religious authorities affected by a bribe. This arrest had been affected by a bribe. What was the bribe? The Sanhedrin paid Judas 30 pieces of silver to betray Jesus. So the John passage, verse 2, tells of the violation of the first commandment or first law, violation of the first law on our list. This arrest was affected by a bribe, not a bride, a bribe. In John 18, verse 3, we read, they came thither with lanterns and torches and weapons. This violated another of the Sanhedrin laws. There was to be no steps taken toward criminal proceedings after sunset. Law number 2. We see here that there are 4 groups of people present at the arrest. We have the Roman soldiers, a minimum of 400 up to 600, armed. Secondly, we have the servant of the high priest. His name's Malchus. He was here representing the high priest who could not be there because the high priest at this every Passover time was, every time there's a Sabbath and that, he was forbidden to leave his compound because he could become ceremonially unclean and would be unfit to offer up the Passover sacrifice. That's going to be at 9:30 on the Friday morning. We see we see that the Roman soldiers, we see Malchus, the servant of the high priest, representing the high priest. Some other Jewish officers, we see temple guard. We have the captains of the temple. These were the Jewish temple police. They had a police force. And these guys are responsible for maintaining order in the inner court. There was a sign on the wall between the inner and outer court, and that sign says that any Gentile who crosses from the outer court into the inner court will be punished by execution, and these guys were there to make sure that didn't happen. That's one of the things they're there for. And then we see also we have some Sanhedrin members here because we have chief priests and elders. In Luke chapter 22, verse 52, we see the words, Jesus said unto the chief priests, captains of the temple, and the elders. So we see here we have the presence of the chief priests and the elders. This violates the third law that the Sanhedrin members were not allowed to participate in the arrest. Not a good track record so far. If we were to look at the Mark account, we're told that it was a multitude that came. So there must have been more than a minimum of 400 people present at this arrest. And, at least 425 people, at least. And they carried swords and staves. And the Greek word for swords here means there's large military combat swords. So these soldiers expected to come upon an armed insurrection. And this is significant in light of what Peter is going to do. Good old Peter. If we look at the John account in John chapter 18, verses 4 to 5, we read there that when the cohort and the accompanying people began to approach, Jesus now takes control. He takes control and he asks them, "Whom seek ye?" They answered him, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus said to them, "I am." And by that expression, he meant more than to identify himself as Jesus. What he was doing by using that expression was he was claiming deity. The phrase can be interpreted as the great I am, which is a Jehovah of the Hebrew Bible, the one who revealed himself to Moses as the I am that I am, back in Exodus chapter 3, verse 14. And we see the result when he said that in verse 6, that when he said I am, they went backward and fell to the ground. At least 425 men went backward and fell to the ground. So the expression there simply couldn't mean that, oh yeah, I'm Jesus. But what it would have meant was the I am. It was a statement of deity. It's not he that you see in your translation that's added. Jesus showed them that he was in total control. And by a simple word, I am, he forced the entire arresting party down to the ground. Throughout the scriptures, when we find people in the presence of God, they always fall on their faces in worship. Falling backwards is not a sign of blessing, but it's a sign of judgment or discipline. Now, Judas was with them, we see in verse 5 of John 18. And the point of this was to let them know that if he were arrested, it was only because he allowed himself to be arrested. Jesus allowed himself to be arrested because he was in full control of the entire situation. And we see in verse 7 that he asked a second time, "Whom seek ye?" They replied again, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus said again, "I am." And here he's using it in the sense in which it was translated, I'm the one you're looking for. I'm Jesus of Nazareth. So he had really revealed who he was to the Roman cohort twice. Now, there was no problem about Judas having to identify him. Neither was there any need for Judas to fulfill what he had promised to do. But, Judas got paid, so he's going to earn his money. And we see that according to Mark chapter 14, verse 44, it says, "Now he that betrayed him had given them a token, saying, Whomsoever I shall kiss, that is he. Take him and lead him away safely." So this was the sign that had been agreed upon, so that they would know which of the men in the garden was Jesus. However, there was no need for that sign now. But Judas, I'm going to earn my money, or big noting himself, he now begins to draw near to Jesus. And at this point, Jesus gives them a warning. And we see this in Luke chapter 22, verse 47. He drew near unto Jesus to kiss him, but Jesus said unto him, "Judas, betrayest thou the Son of Man with a kiss?" This warning didn't stop Judas. We're told at the end of Mark chapter 14, verse 45, that Judas said, "Rabbi," and kissed him. And the way the Greek is written here, it wasn't just a one kiss. It says that he kissed him many times. He kept on kissing him. Yeah, back in Psalm chapter 2, verse 12, we see back there that kissing is also a sign of homage. The kiss of a follower for a rabbi is a kiss of submission. It's a kiss of honor. It's a kiss of homage to the rabbi. But what we see here is that Judas is actually profaning this and even calls Jesus rabbi. Yet that which was sacred to Judaism in the Jewish world was now feigned by Judas because his kiss was a kiss of betrayal. It was not a kiss of homage or honor to Jesus. It was a kiss of betrayal. Peter now proves something. Peter had said during the Passover supper that I'm willing to die for you, Jesus. And if we look at John chapter 18, verse 10, we see there's truth in this statement because Simon Peter, therefore, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant's ear and cut off his right ear. The Greek word for swords, which the Roman army had identified those guys' swords as the military combat swords. The Greek word for the sword that Peter used here means it's a long ceremonial knife, which sometimes is used for sacrificing of the Passover lamb. And Peter starts to slash away with his sword in spite of the fact that there are at least 400 Roman soldiers there with their military combat swords. Yeah, and there were also the temple police there as well. But not Peter, mate. I'm going to take all these 400 plus guys on with my little knife here. And he did prove that he was willing to die for Jesus because he was fortunate that they didn't kill him. He was such a poor swordsman that he didn't cut off the guy's head. He simply cut off his right ear. Fortunately, it wasn't the ear of a soldier, but it was the ear of the servant of the high priest who was possibly not even armed at all. Now, John's family, John the Apostle's family, was friendly with the family of Caiaphas. So John knew the servant, and that the servant's name was Malchus. And Jesus now immediately stopped Peter and said, according to verse 52 of Matthew 26, "Put up again thy sword into its place. For all they that take the sword shall perish by the sword." In Luke 22, verse 51, we see that Jesus proceeds to heal the ear of Malchus by putting it back in its place. And Luke is the only one who mentions the healing. I guess he's a doctor, so he is fascinated here to record that such a healing was possible. And if we compare the different gospel accounts of this incident, we see how they only recorded details that seem significant to each of the gospel writers here. And we need to take the four accounts into consideration, realizing that even then, they may not give us the complete picture. So the action of Jesus healing Malchus's ear actually saved Peter's life. And concerning the healing here, it is the only miracle of which we know which Jesus performed on a fresh wound. It was the only miracle of which we know which Jesus performed upon an enemy. It was not in response to the personal faith of Malchus. It was in response to saving the life of Peter. All of this that we're seeing here had to do with Jesus' own victory during the agony of Gethsemane. According to John 18, verse 11, we read here that he said, "The cup which the Father has given me, shall I not drink it?" So this shows us that he actually received the answer to his prayer, "Take this cup from me, not my will, but thine be done." And what we see here is that he received the answer to his prayer, and he says, "I'm going to drink the cup." Now, Jesus teaches Peter three things here. He says, first up, all who wish to live by the sword will die that way. The faith, the Christian faith, cannot be defended by the sword. We are permitted to use the sword for personal or state defense, but not for defense of the faith. According to Matthew 26, verse 53, spiritual battles are only to be fought by spiritual means. Because in Matthew 26, 53, Jesus had 12 legions at his disposal. Then in verse 54, the Matthew account, we see that Jesus told Peter that what was happening to himself was necessary. Because Jesus says, listen, how then will the scriptures be fulfilled if I'm not taken away like this? And this proves the faith of Jesus in scripture as to what was relevant for that occasion, and implicitly what would be relevant to his second coming. Now, in verse 56 of Matthew 26, we see that everything that was happening according to plan. Because here again, but all this is come to pass that the scriptures of the prophets might be fulfilled. See, Jesus had a deep belief in the reliability of Old Testament prophecy. And a forecast that Jesus made in the upper room was also fulfilled here. And we find this in Matthew 26, verse 56. It says, then all the disciples left him and fled. We also see here in this passage in Mark 14, 51 and 52. When people wrote stories or biographies back then in the ancient world, they would often include themselves in the account in a very, passive, seemingly irrelevant way. With an example of this in the Gospel of Mark 14, 51 to 52. What Mark says here doesn't connect with anything at all with what either was before it or what comes after it. But Mark, in Mark chapter 14, verse 51 to 52, was identifying himself. And he says, and a certain young man followed with him, having a linen cloth cast about him over his naked body, and they lay hold on him, but he left the linen cloth and fled naked. That would have been Mark himself. So he had actually been an eyewitness of the arrest. And we also see that John does something similar in his gospel, because he says, when he's writing his gospel, he says, the disciple whom Jesus loved. And that was John. Okay, the trial, religious trial. There are two trials involved. There are two sets of trials. We're going to have the Jewish religious trial, and then we're going to have the Roman civil trial. And each of these trials have 3 stages. So there's going to be 6 stages we're going to see. Paragraph 166 to 170 covers the 3 stages of the religious trial. And the issue in the religious trial we're going to see will be blasphemy. So Judas is not going to be needed for the religious trial. Nothing on the Jewish law required his presence. But he must have kept close contact because he knew the outcome of the trial. We're going to see that a little bit later on. Now we're going to see first up the trial before Annas, and this we're going to find in John chapter 18, verses 12 to 14, and John 18, verses 19 to 23. Now Annas served as the high priest between the years 7 to 14 AD. And then he was deposed by the Roman procurator, a man called Valerius Gratus. But he maintained control of the priesthood. He was followed in turn in the priesthood by 4 of his own sons and a son-in-law. And the 4th of those sons was followed by the son-in-law of Annas, who was a man called Caiaphas. Caiaphas was the one who ran the temple for profit. That's how things stood at the time we're studying here. On the Jewish law, a high priest holds his position until his death. But Annas, in this instance, had been deposed by the Roman governor and had been replaced. Now, this son-in-law, Caiaphas, was acting as high priest. And that's what we're going to see in these texts. We're going to see both Annas referred to as a high priest and Caiaphas referred to as the high priest. Annas was still the high priest from the Jewish perspective on the Jewish law, but Caiaphas was the high priest from the Roman perspective by Roman authority. Annas was also the chief proprietor of the bazaar of the sons of Annas. Remember, well, sorry, some of you won't remember, but some will. Back in paragraph 31, it was his bazaar, it was his business, that on 2 occasions Jesus had come and overturned the money tables and had driven out those who were the sellers of sacrificial animals and birds. And that had created animosity between Annas and Jesus. And that was the reason for the first stage of this religious trial being held before him. He has a grudge. Now, the purpose of this first stage was to try to establish a religious charge. And in verses 12 to 13 of John 18, we are told that they brought Jesus after his arrest for trial before Annas first. This violated a 4th commandment of the Sanhedrin laws, that no trials were to be conducted before the morning sacrifices. And verse 14 clearly states here that sentence had already been decreed before the trial. So in essence, this was pretty much a kangaroo court. It reads, Caiaphas was he who gave counsel to the Jews that it was expedient that one man should die for the people. And that was back in quite a while ago, back in paragraph 119, and we find it in John chapter 11, verse 50. Now we read it in John 18, verse 19. The high priest therefore asked Jesus of his disciples and of his teaching. So Annas inquired of Jesus concerning 2 things. First of all, give me the names of your disciples. Why? Because he wants Jesus to incriminate them. And secondly, his teaching in order to incriminate Jesus. So as to find that he's got to try and find a religious charge that he can have against Jesus. To which Jesus responded, according to verse 20, I've spoken openly to the world. I have taught in synagogues and in the temple, where all the Jews come together, and in secret spake I nothing. So in this one statement by Jesus, he reminded Annas of the Mishnaic law. This trial was being conducted in secret. This was in contrast to the teaching by Jesus that he has done all his teaching publicly. And he did it openly in synagogues, in the temple compound, before all the Jewish leaders. So we're told clearly here that the 5th in our list of the Sanhedrin laws was violated. The law that said that there should be no secret trials, only public ones. Number 5, law number 5. This would also be true with the 2nd and 3rd stage of this religious trial. Verses 21 and 22, we see that Jesus again referred them to their own law and challenged them to produce a charge. Why are you asking me? What's the charge against me? Why are you asking me to incriminate myself? He wasn't responsible to answer their questions, but they must produce 2 or 3 witnesses to conduct his trial. They were not to seek charges for a man already arrested. After he had been arrested, they were responsible for producing the charge. And at which point, according to verse 22, one of the officers standing by struck Jesus with his hand, saying, Answerest thou the high priest so? This is the first of several mistreatments which Jesus would suffer during this night. And the result here was that they were not ready for the trial, and there was no specific charge found. And the first stage of the religious trial ended in failure, because none of this was supposed to occur on the night of the Passover observance, because they didn't want it happening then. However, Jesus forced their hand by identifying the traitor Judas and said they were confused and disorganized. And then Jesus responded after he was struck. If I've spoken evil, bear witness of the evil. But if I've spoken well, why do you strike me? This is in verse 23 of John 18. They were conducting an illegal proceeding. Now we're going to come before Caiaphas. And we're going to see this in several passages. We're going to see it in Matthew 26, verses 57, 59, and 68. Mark 14, 53 and 55 to 65. Luke 22, 54, and John 18, 24. So this is the second stage of the trial before Caiaphas. Remember, Caiaphas is the son-in-law of Annas, served as high priest from the years 18 to 36, 37 AD. He was the one who led the religious leaders in rejecting the first sign of Jonah, the resurrection of Lazarus. And this trial was happening near a few years after the midpoint of his high priesthood in AD 30. It's held at his house. And Luke noted that the Sanhedrin gathered into the high priest's house. Luke 22, verse 54. It should have been held where? It should have been held in the hall of judgment in the temple complex, so that the public could have access to the trial. This was the sixth law violated. Sanhedrin trials could only be conducted in the hall of judgment in the temple compound. The Sanhedrin was composed of 71 members. Of these, 24 were chief priests, Sadducees. 24 were elders, Pharisees. 22 were scribes, Pharisees. And the last one was the chief priest, also a Sadducee. And in a capital case for the Sanhedrin trial to be conducted, there had to be a minimum attendance of 23 members. Out of 23 votes, 11 were sufficient to acquit, but 13 were needed to convict. You had to have a majority of 2 to convict. We don't know how many were actually in this trial, but what we do know for sure is that not all 71 members were present. The maximum that could have been present would have been 69. Why? Because the 2 who would have been absent would have been Nicodemus, and the other one would have been Joseph of Arimathea. And from what we know about them, they would not have voted with the crowd. Why? Because they were at the time they were private believers in Jesus. They were silent believers in Jesus. So now we have to look for some false witnesses. In Matthew 26, verse 59, we read here, the chief priests and the whole council sought false witnesses against Jesus that they might put him to death. So they brought false witnesses first, and that violated the 7th Sanhedrin law in our list. During the trial, the defense had the first word before the prosecutors could present the accusation, but they are now seeking witnesses to come forward first. We're told in Mark 18:45 that it was the whole council present that was seeking to convict Jesus. Law number 8 was violated, that all may argue in favor of acquittal, but not all may argue in favor of guilt. The inability to attain witnesses who agreed in every detail violated a 9th of their laws, that there must be at least 2 witnesses and their testimonies had to agree in every detail. The religious leaders presented one false witness after another, trying to find 2 in agreement, but one by one, their testimonies were disqualified. Finally, they found 2 witnesses who seemed to be saying the same thing, but in actual fact, they were not. Although they sounded similar, there was a difference sufficient enough to disqualify them as witnesses. Mark gives us one version and Matthew gives us the other version. In Mark chapter 14, verse 58, it reads, I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another made without hands. That's one witness. In Matthew's version, in 26 verse 61, we read, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to build it in 3 days. One testimony used the words, I will do this, whereas the other testimony is, I am able to do this. Under Jewish law, the difference between I will and I am able was sufficient to disqualify. Will destroy is a statement of intent. Able to destroy is a statement of ability, and the Mark account, 14 verse 59, recognizes this fact, and not even so did their witnesses agree together. So the charge here that the leaders were trying to bring up initially was disrespect for the temple, and under Roman law, a threat against a temple would result in a capital offense. And that is why the Sanhedrin is trying to massage what Jesus said into being a threat. They want to bring Jesus to the Roman court as a threat to the empire, and they would be the ones who would put him to death. It didn't work. Didn't work. Caiaphas now takes charge. In Matthew 26, verse 62, and the high priest stood up and said unto him, do you answer nothing? What is it which these witness against you? When Caiaphas demanded that Jesus should respond to the charges by Jewish law, he had no need to respond. It was almost as though Jesus was playing the role of a keeper of the Mishnah here. He was maintaining his legal rights under the law, but his accusers were not. So Jesus held his peace in verse 63 of Matthew 26. What Jesus was being asked to do violated a 10th Sanhedrin law, that there was to be no allowance for the accused to testify against himself. As he doesn't get any response from Jesus, Caiaphas now puts Jesus under oath. In verse 63, the high priest said unto him, I adjure you by the living God that you tell us whether you are the Messiah, the Son of God. In a Jewish court of law, the phrase, I adjure you, means to put someone under oath. And based upon his statement, Caiaphas obviously understood that Jesus claimed to be the Messiah, and he clearly understood that the Messiah was supposed to be the Son of God. And Mark quoted Caiaphas as saying, are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed? In the Jewish mindset, the term the Blessed is a substitute for the name of God. Since he had been put under oath, Jesus had to give an answer. And in verse 64 of Matthew 26, we see that Jesus said unto him, thou hast said, nevertheless, I say you, henceforth you shall see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven. And Mark records it in Mark 14:62. Jesus is saying, I am. So Jesus here claimed to be the Messiah and told them that the next time they would see him would be in his glorious second coming, and the second coming will be visible in hell itself. And this demonstrates the Jewishness of both Gospels, since we have the word power. Power is another term for God. Remember, they don't like to use the name of God, so they use blessed or the name or power. Okay, the verdict and the sentence. In Matthew 26, verse 65, we read that the high priest tore his garments. This violated law number 11 of the Sanhedrin law, that the high priest was forbidden to rend his garments. The one exception was when he heard a blasphemy uttered. Then the high priest said, this is verse 65, he has spoken blasphemy. What further need have we of witnesses? That was a violation of the 12th Sanhedrin law. The charges could not originate with the judges. Judges could only investigate charges brought to them. At the same time, the high priest was violating again the Sanhedrin law about the requirement of 2 witnesses, that they had to agree in every detail before a charge could be made. He was dispensing with the witnesses altogether, yet he makes the accusation. Also, we're told in this passage in the Mark account, verse 64, that he said, you have heard the blasphemy. Specific charge against Jesus now was a charge of blasphemy. This violated the 13th Sanhedrin law, that the accusation of blasphemy was only valid if the very name of God, Yud-He, Vah-He, YHVH, had been pronounced. At no point in this trial did Jesus do that. We see from Mark's account in verse 64, they all condemned him worthy of death. The high priest stated, "What further need have we of witnesses?" This was an enormous statement, given that his witnesses had all been disqualified, including the two whose testimonies had originally seemed to agree. Again, they broke law number 9. No witnesses. At least 2 witnesses had to agree in every detail. Now we said we don't need witnesses. In verse 66 of Matthew 26, they answered and said, "He is worthy of death." Violated number 14 Sanhedrin law. A person could not be condemned on the basis of his own words alone. It also violated number 15 Sanhedrin law. The verdict could not be announced at night, only in the daytime. It also violated number 16 Sanhedrin law. In cases of capital punishment, blasphemy was a capital offense. The trial and the verdict of guilty cannot occur at the same time, but must be separated by at least 24 hours. Also, the calling out for the sentence of death was made by acclamation, and this was a violation of the number 17 Sanhedrin law, that voting for the death penalty had to be done by individual count, beginning with the youngest, so that the youngest would not be swayed by the older members of the Sanhedrin. We're also told that all of them present condemned him to death. All of them. And by their own law, he should now have been released. Now he should have been acquitted. This was the 18th Sanhedrin law violated. A unanimous decision for guilt shows innocence, since it is impossible for all present to agree without plotting. And this was a massive plot. It was a conspiracy. Sentence was also pronounced upon Jesus on this night, the sentence of death, violating the 19th Sanhedrin law. Sentence cannot be pronounced until 3 days after the verdict of guilty. What happened at this point is covered by both Matthew and Mark. Looking at Matthew 26, verse 67, we read, "Then they spat in his face and buffeted him, and some of them smote him with the palms of their hands, saying, 'Prophesy unto us, you Messiah. Who was it that struck you?' The Mark account, Mark 14:65, says that the officers received him with blows of their hands. This violated the number 20 Sanhedrin law. Judges were to be humane and kind. It also violated the 21st Sanhedrin law. A person condemned to death cannot be beaten or scourged beforehand. So 21 specific Mishnaic laws had been broken. The very thing that the leaders had against Jesus from the beginning was that he broke the laws of the Mishnah. Now they also had been forced to break some of them. They themselves were guilty of breaking Mishnaic laws. Going back to the Matthew account and the Mark account together, we notice there that they beat him with their fists, punching him in the face with the palms of their hands, slapping him, and they spat on him. What Jesus was suffering here was considered among the highest indignities, and they themselves were liable to be punished to a greater or lesser degree. To strike with the fist was punishable with a fine of 4 denarii, 4 days' wages. To smite with the palm of the hands was punishable with a fine of 200 denarii, 200 days' wages. To spit in the face was punishable by a fine of 400 denarii, more than a year's wages. As these were the judges themselves, they would ignore the fines for which they had made themselves liable. We have now moved to the end of the second stage of the religious trial. Jesus has been condemned on the grounds of blasphemy, and the Sanhedrin had broken 21 of their own Mishnaic laws. This event took place between the first night and the first day of Passover. Remember, Jewish day, night precedes day. Night comes before day. Law number 22 in the list is broken, that no trials could be held on the eve of the Sabbath or a feast day. So this stage of the trial was a complete travesty of Jewish civil justice by the laws of that day. By the laws of that day, Jesus should have been released. That brings us to the end. If you see the contact details there, or you can follow us on Facebook or our Instagram.